we're gonna knock this all out, I think, tonight. But when Alec and Alan and I met the last time, when we had the last overall task force meeting in the breakout, we came up with a little bit of a framework. Can I put things in the chat? Like, is that part of the recording? Like, if I just put some of the notes in? Okay, I just want to make sure we're good.
I can
Okay.
also make you a co-host if you want to share screen.
I guess I could do that. I put together just a Word document of just some of the information that we had. So yeah, why don't I just do that? So I'll just share my screen, if that works. Okay. All right. Can everybody see that? And I can zoom in. Let me zoom in to make it a little bit bigger. Is that big enough for everybody? I just see heads nodding. Okay. So what we had kind of talked about, what we thought based on the questions that were also suggested and things that we talk about. So what we kind of came up with was, because we only have 30 minutes to present, and we thought one of the really important things when Alec, Alan, and I had been talking, and Ron, I don't think you'd really disagree with this, was that it really was important that we kind of give an overview of the history of anti-Semitism, because I don't know that everybody has that full context. Obviously, we do. Most of us, as part of the Jewish cohort, have a good grasp of that. So like Ron in your email earlier talking about like the conspiracy theories and things along those lines. So we thought it would just be good to kind of give a quick little overview of the history of anti-Semitism. Some of the notes I put in here, some of the slides that ADL and AJC have, certainly, Ron, if there's anything JCRC has as well, but obviously, this is what we were talking about the last time. And then we thought it was important to go into the aspects of how is anti-Semitism manifesting today, which is really to the question of what are the types of hate crimes, hate incidents, bias that have been directed at people represented in our cohort. So that's where we thought if we gave the history first, the background, and then we can explain what we've been seeing, and we can talk about some of the statistics that we have and some of the data that has come out over the past several years, and we can specifically obviously narrow down to Montgomery County. Again, we can flush this out a little bit more, but I just wanted the framework for everybody, and we can talk about here, whether it was community, whether it was school incidents, which obviously was part of the MCPS presentation, but this is not just about schools. And so we can present all the different aspects of the way that we've been seeing it showing up in the community the past several years. And then the other thing we talked about is the correlation of anti-Semitism and other forms of hate, because this is about an anti-hate task force. And what we are seeing, obviously, when we see a rise in certain forms of hate, we tend to see a rise in a lot of other forms of hate. So that, I think, the question about, which Ron, you put in your email earlier, how do we create a zero tolerance society for all forms of hate? I think that really kind of fits within that subject matter in a slide that we could talk about there. We also thought it was important, and we may want to move this up, but understanding Judaism in the Jewish community, understanding that we are not a monolith. I know, Alec, have you figured that out? But obviously, we're not a monolith. We know the Jewish community, obviously, there are all different forms of practice that people have. There's Reform, there's Conservative, there's Orthodox. There is, people who are non-practicing in the sense they don't ever go to Shabbat services, but just understanding the dynamic and the impact that also has on anti-Semitism. So we may want to just talk a little bit about some of that. We also thought it was important to focus on the impacts of extremism in general to the communities and how we see this related to anti-Semitism coming from the Jewish community, but also while we work on a lot of issues with a lot of other marginalized groups as well. And this really, the questions, some of them that were posed about, what can be done to eliminate hate crimes, hate incidents, and bias from the community, and then also adding in things related to improving safety and security. And obviously we know Montgomery County has been really, forward thinking, particularly with things like security grants, and as one of the only localities that really has something like that. And so we could talk a little bit about that and other things that can be done. We also then thought it was important to talk about things in education, and not just necessarily in the K through 12 classroom, but what we're seeing on college campuses, in workplaces, the community in general. So really, what can we be doing? Like, what are the solutions to this? And that it's like a whole of society approach. And so that's sort of the question about how can the county increase awareness, understanding about crimes and incidents, educational institutions, workplace, nonprofits, businesses, which then leads to specifically one of the things, Ron, we actually did talk about this, but I'm glad you put it up in email because I forgot to have it in here. But really, what is the role of public officials and other community leaders in responding then too? And what are things that we can be recommending, particularly if we have legislative solutions, which is some of the things that may want to come out of this, particularly when we're dealing with a lot of extremism and things like flyering. Are the laws that we can be changing? There are things the state is considering. And that really all of that leads to, we can talk about, and again, a lot of this can be moved around, but Alan pointed out that I forgot to add on here that we talked about the White House national strategy, and that there has been a national strategy put out on anti-Semitism, and what is the impact on us at the local level as far as implementation of that. Because it is focused on anti-Semitism because there has been such a huge rise, but we also know that it will be beneficial for other types of forms of hate and bias that we're seeing. So I kind of took all the notes from the last time we talked and then some of the discussions on the emails. And so that I thought would be a good way of creating a 30-minute presentation before we do Q&A. And what I thought we could do tonight is maybe just flush out a little bit more, and I can take notes, these details of how we want to, and who wants to take different aspects of it. And we can put together kind of a slide deck with some visual aids, and then we can kind of break out how we want to present it. And actually, just that brings up before I pause, Bertha, as far as presenting, do we all present? Do I just present as the chair? How do we, because we're the first ones to go. So I want to figure out how we set the tone.
It's actually up to you. So it could be just you, or you could, have a team of 2 or 3 presenting with you.
Okay. So I guess then we can decide that then. Okay. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't like excluding or anything like that with anybody.
Can I suggest that since we have a half hour and we want to convey as much information, although we don't want to overwhelm people, we really want to give them the salient points, that Meredith, you're the chair, you take the lead in presenting, and if during the course of your conversation you think there's something that comes to your mind, for example, if you want to say, for example, in New York, for example, Jews who wear traditional garb have found themselves and Jews who wear kippot or coverings may want, and in our own community, we have a large concentration of Jews who are Orthodox in Potomac and Alec and Kent Mill and Alec. I don't know if there's anything you want to add about that as a resident. I'm just saying that's like you could say, or you could say, the grant program, Ron, I know you were instrumental in getting that started. What do you think? And I would say, well, the thing is we have to make sure that people can get the full 20,000. Now they're only able to get 16. So more money and just, that's the way to incorporate us, I think. Use us as like occasionally, and if you don't get to everybody, I don't think anybody's ego should be damaged, because mine certainly won't be, because I just think that like, if this is to convey a message and we're all friends and colleagues, I think it's just better to boom, boom, boom. And if you want to break it up a little bit, so it's not a half an hour of lecturing and so you get somewhere, that's fine. But otherwise, I think you should take the straight lead on it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm comfortable with that. I think that there are different aspects within here that everybody does add value. So there may be just like quick, hey, Alan, do you want to talk about this specifically? Ron, do you want to, like, I think that that's totally fine. If Rabbi Shankman is able to make it, I would ask her to just highlight a few things related to, Judaism in general, or Alec, that actually might be a really good thing for you. Like, I think that is, yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah. Alan, you look like you were going to say
something. On your grandchild. Like I heard through Benham told me I had to say Mazel Tov.
Meredith, I think that's a good point. I think, Ron makes an excellent point. You sort of be the main presenter here, but yes, I think it would be important at different times to ask one of us or both of us or whomever to sort of chime in, and we can predetermine when that might be. I think it does mix it up. Having one person talk the entire time is just going to bore people to tears. Not that you're not exciting and fabulous, but you know.
We've already figured it out. Meredith and I have sent our kids to college this week, and I think I don't know if I have any more tear ducts left at this point.
I didn't actually cry. I'm good.
Let's take the record. I didn't cry. My eyes were leaking.
Great. So how do you want me to share my screen again and just start flushing out some of the details, and I can type notes for everybody then, and then I can follow up, and then we can figure out as far as putting together like a slide deck or anything like that, which is fairly easy to do. All right, so let me share my screen again. Okay. You guys see that?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so as far as obviously the history of anti-Semitism, I think between Alan and I, to be very honest, we probably have this already together. But
I think so.
Ron, Alec, is there anything else that you would want us to add in here? I mean, between AJC and ADL, we have a couple of different visual aids. Ron, is there anything you would want to add here?
The one talking point that
Yeah.
I've been doing when I've
I'm
done.
going to take notes.
It may not be worth even noting, but what I'm saying, but I have made it a very key point when I have been speaking to different groups and mostly synagogues on Shabbat, saying anti-Semitism is a disease for which we don't have an antibiotic or a vaccine, and it manifests itself, and I assume you use terms like this in every generation. It's been going on. It occurs in places where there are Jews. It occurs in countries where there are no Jews. Ben Gurion famously say the world will give us a break against anti-Semitism for 50 years, and then they'll go on. Anti-Semitism, I think the most important thing, it is the reason it succeeds. It is the most diverse, malleable, and flexible form of hatred out there. It's the reason why we have communists. It's the reason why we have capitalists. It's the reason why the weather changes. It's the reason why we had COVID. And I think it's important. People have to understand that anti-Semitism is a form of hatred that is so malleable and so viral and so generational that our ability to stamp it out and literally is a multi-generational strategy. Otherwise, we're dealing with it during the peaks and not the valleys. That this is not a one-year strategy, a 10-year. This is a if we truly want to eradicate bias, we have to create a culture of zero tolerance of hate towards anybody, and it has to be a priority of Montgomery County for the next 50 years. It's not, we can't just do it, 2 years from now, and then, because then in 20 years from now, when we're old Jewish communal professionals or members of the Jewish community, will be sitting around talking about 20 years ago. So if you truly, if the only way to stop it is to make it a absolute laser-focused multi-generational goal that involves every society, and everybody agrees in society from all factors of society, to make it not just, oh, things are getting bad, we need to act. 10 years later, things are getting back, we need to add. That's just my 2 points: flexibility.
Yeah, no. And I think just to add to that, and it's not to sound defeatist in any way, but anti-Semitism is called the oldest hatred because it has existed for millennia, and eradicating it may not be a realistic thing. The question is, how do we suppress it a little bit more? And I think today that goes to your point around the multi-generational. How do we suppress it? The fact that it has now been mainstreamed. Right. More so. And we've seen that, the peaks and valleys, but we really are at a very, in 2023 now that we're having this conversation. And I think that, to your point, I think is something that we should note in here, that we would all love to say it's going to be gone, in 10 years, but we also want to be realistic about it. And that's where some of these other things come in, like you just noted.
Yeah, I think the issue, the way I always frame it, is normalization versus marginalization. And if we can marginalize the haters, we can push them back into the, nips of society where they lived for all that time. And, we will have done a great service in pushing back on anti-Semitism. No, we can't eradicate it. I would agree with that completely. I think some of the stuff, Ron, that you were talking about actually shows up in the second bullet about manifestations of anti-Semitism, how it comes from, the right, the left, the people in the name of religion, people who are simply ignorant. That kind of stuff, I think, is always important. And the only thing that we also haven't talked about is conspiracy theories. And that's, I think, a key element in the polarized society that we're living in, is people's willingness to believe in conspiracy theories is also fueling this modern manifestation of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, Alan, I just know, I don't know, well, I know you can see. So I was gonna say, I know you're off camera, but so I just put in, because I know you and I both have slides that show the old conspiracy theories. I think if we highlight that at the beginning, and then when we talk about the manifesting today, some of the things Ron just said and what you just said, I wrote, it's right, left, up, down, you know, all of that. We can then show how those are showing up today again. Some of them, the power, the greed, all, you know, the Holocaust denial. I think we can highlight that there. So I think then we're good, unless anybody has anything else, just to move on to the second one about how it's manifesting today, which we actually kind of just answered also. So is there anything else anybody wants to add to that? And again, I will send this out after, just so everybody can see it, but I'm typing it up as we're doing it, just so for the open meetings, people can see what we're doing.
Just one thing, I think finding a modern day example of a conspiracy would be very good, because I mean, we knew it took about 2 weeks before people. Well, I think showing the conspiracy that the Jews are responsible for COVID, it is perfect. I mean, it's.
Yeah, I have a couple of those images, Ron. Just reminded me. I'll put it on a slide.
I just think it's like, since we all went through that post-traumatic stress disorder of having to live through that, I think, you know, because you could talk about things that have happened in history, but this is within everybody's reach, because they just lived through it. And I think also, and I don't know where, and by the way, I think you guys did a great job like structuring it. I think it's going to plug in and go great. Thank you. Social media.
You're welcome.
Thank you, ma'am. I think social media. I don't know if that, if we get to that.
Yep. No. That should be in here. Yeah.
But
we need to cover that.
Like Alan was saying, you know, every idiot today who's a racist, and I know we're being recorded, but these racists are idiots, have a platform. Whereas the other method was to scream on a block and hope that you got some media coverage, or frankly, the flyer, people who are on flyers are very yesterday. I mean, that's very yesterday type of stuff. I mean, it gets people crazy, but it's very yesterday. But everybody today can speak out. And I also think one other thing we're going to be releasing a paper in about at our board meeting and issuing a paper. We're doing a whole paper on democratization, polarization, civil discourse, and talking about how protection of the Jewish community and of all minorities, you cannot, frankly, in the end, it's a healthy democracy with safeguards of protection for minority rights that protects us. In the end, the collapse of a governmental system, that we can do everything we want. If we don't live in a democracy where everybody has access to power and to change public opinion, we're all doomed, everybody in society. So I think strengthening.
Ron, we've got some slides actually with quotes from people like Eric Ward that actually express that sentiment. So we can incorporate that in. I think
Alan, you and I should look and see, because I think we probably have some of the same quotes. So let's just pick and choose. I think that would be really great. I just want to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ron.
Get that point across in a quote, like you know, very simple. But I really believe that, and also the civil discourse and polarization, that society, that anti-Semitism has fomented in a society where it's easy to say what you want. You blame things on people you want. You have a platform to say what you want. It's for the unexplainable, and people are not willing to hear differences of opinion because our democracy is threatened, and democratic values, and because we've become so polarized, and people are resistant to challenging their own notions. So I think people are less willing to believe in than they were in the past, that they might actually be. People are not willing to self-examine anymore their own viewpoints, but we've come hardened. But that's it. Those are my main points for the entire document.
Yeah, I want to just bring up the one quick thing before we move to the next one. So there are a couple of different modern day examples that we can use. The COVID one, I think, is really impactful because and I want to point this out because Jeff, you're actually on here. So when the COVID pandemic started, there were all these different conspiracy theories that the Jewish community conspired with the Asian community, or specifically the Chinese community, to create a vaccine together, release it into the, to the world, and then the Jews controlled it because they created a vaccine to profit off of it. And I think that actually would be a really good example to show how it's not just anti-Semitism and how this also is impacting other communities. So it just made me think of that, Jeff, because you were sitting here too.
Yeah, I think it's also tied to George Soros as well. If you want to highlighting the globalist piece that
of course
has been coming up. I just wanted to say, just related to the global perspective, I only say this because it's fresh from a meeting I just had at the State Department a couple of days ago. But when you had highlighted the broader scope, I would just make sure my perspective would be one where you might want to include the State Department's special envoy, just being able to highlight how these tropes have national security implications for how we project influence in the world. And I think being able to bat those ridiculous conspiracy theories down has there's a moral authority for how the United States can position. I think being able to take on these issues is something that's important to the State Department and our global interests as well. So just
actually, I think I would put that down here almost. Oh, sorry, I don't know who else was talking, but the impacts of extremism, I think that's under like some of the democracy stuff specifically. Yeah, sorry, Alan, was that you? I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I was just agreeing with Jeffrey. I think that the implication for national security and America's image in the world is a really important thing. That's why we have the special envoy, and that's something we don't often talk about, but I think it's an important element as we go through this. The other thing I wanted to mention, Meredith, is in addition to the COVID conspiracy, there's also QAnon.
Oh, yeah. Let me write that down.
QAnon that everybody knows about, with the silent hand that's controlling the world. Who do you think they're talking about? It's me, it's you, it's Ron. So also,
go to Common Pizza.
Right, exactly. If we need a modern day example, we could use one or the other or both.
I think we could use both, Alan. Honestly, I think you're right. I think we could highlight both. We can put up an image and just explain how that's showing up. I think that's really good.
Yeah.
Great. So let's just go to the next one just to kind of keep us moving so we're not here until 10:30 at night. The correlation of anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. And what we had talked about is, and we've kind of highlighted some of this, but how it leads to other forms of hate and bias. And really then the question is, how do we create a zero tolerance society for all forms of hate? To me, this goes back to some of the stuff we were talking about, how it has been mainstreamed. And this is where, we touched on social media above, but we can add that in here, and how things, it's become acceptable in society. Stereotypes, we all know stereotypes lead to, ADL personally has a thing called our pyramid of hate. And we know that things like stereotyping can lead to non-inclusive policies, belittling jokes. We know that if that's not, put in check, it can lead to, moving up sort of the pyramid of hate, where we start seeing things like racial slurs or anti-Semitic slurs, in classrooms, in workplaces, microaggressions. And then we start seeing people acting out. We see the vandalism, we see the direct threats, the harassment, and the assaults. And it all just kind of continues that pattern. And so I just think that that's one of those things that goes back to the normalization, the mainstreaming of this. And so that's just my thoughts, but I'm open to hear from what other people think.
The only thing I would add, Meredith, in this point is to invoke the Southern Poverty Law Center's statistic. I don't know if you guys heard about this, but the SPLC looked at all of the hate groups in the United States, and some were anti-Black and some were anti-Asian, et cetera, et cetera. All of them were anti-Semitic, all of them. So it's this gateway hatred that leads to anti-Black racism and all these other things, has to have sort of this almost, like I said, like a gateway through anti-Semitism leads to all those other things. So I think it's an important element of this that we should let people know about.
Perfect. Yeah, I just wrote that down. That's great. Yes.
Yeah, I've got some slides on that if you need.
Okay, perfect. Okay, and then I think the next one, understanding Judaism and the Jewish community. I mean, I think we, Rabbi Schenkman could certainly, I think any of us could do this. I think we maybe just kind of, explain that Judaism for many people is a way of life. It is not just their religion. Although it is classified a lot of times as a religion-based crime, I think it is something that we do need to highlight. It is not just there could be somebody who, goes to, like we said, Shabbat services every weekend, and other people do not, but that doesn't mean that they are not Jewish. And there are people who, as Ron pointed out earlier, who are more visibly Jewish than others, but that I think it's just important when you're, trying to understand anti-Semitism, just understanding, Judaism itself. So that was just one of the things that Alec, Alan, and two A's, Alec and Alan and I had talked about specifically. So Alan or Alec, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. And I think Ron has something.
Go ahead, Ron.
I'm just wondering if there might be an interesting statistic in our 2017 demographic report that might be interesting. I'm just wondering if we threw like one or two interesting statistics, not more than one or two, because it's going to get lost. But I mean, if there's about the Jewish community in Montgomery County, because I think people may be surprised that the majority of Jews, for example, don't belong to synagogues, but yet 85% of Jews go to a Passover Seder, and 90% of Jews light Hanukkah candles, and so I think if you want to talk about the diversity, and some people are go to Shabbat, some people are Reform, some people think that they go to Shabbat every weekend. But they go to shul, and there's other people who I know who keep kosher and to the hilt and rarely go to synagogue. But so I mean, I think that it's important to understand the panoply, the smorgasbord of our community is different in observance and garb and tradition and labels and that. But for anybody, but most people in the Jewish community have a still, even in this day, have a neshama, a soul of belonging to the Jewish community, and hurt whether a person who is wearing a traditional black suit and is hurt because he's Jewish, or because a young woman on a campus who's wearing everyday American clothing and has a Jewish star and has it ripped off her neck, that we all feel that pain. And even though we're so different from each other, there still is a tremendous commonality, because people are looking at Israel and seeing them rip themselves apart, and people need to understand that, we can have political differences, and this is not about Israel, but whether it's in Israel, whether we may argue among ourselves, but we're all a united people about our faith and care about each other. I think those bonds, that emotional bond towards each other should be reinforced.
Yeah, and I also think it's important. Oh, and then I see Alec has a question, because the reason why we also brought this up is there is a lack of understanding sometimes that can lead to a form of anti-Semitism if you don't understand certain rituals. And I'm thinking of things like a bris, and when there's a Brit Milah, and there are conspiracy theories around, what rabbis really do, and we've seen that on different, flyers and things like that. And, that is another conspiracy theory, and, related to, that Jews, in history, they, the conspiracy theory that we have murdered Christian children, to harvest their blood and put it into baked matzah, like things like that, because of rituals that we have. And that's what I was just thinking of. It's important to just highlight that. Alec.
Well, I don't know how this ties in, and you all are far more expert on this than I. But when I think about Montgomery County and anti-Semitism, and maybe how easy it is, or how misunderstood it is when teenagers are sort of confronted, or someone scribbles a swastika on a desk and says, "Oh, I didn't really realize that was, how impactful that was." This is more of a question, I think, to you. Is it because the Jewish community, and this is, I guess, I shouldn't generalize it, is so successful, particularly in Montgomery County, that maybe it's not perceived as such a big deal because, look, our congressman is Jewish and our senator is Jewish, United States senator, and these elected officials up and down, state and local level. I mean, they're not really impacted by these kinds of things because, they're obviously a successful community, which I think you can say about some of the other communities as well. But maybe you would say it's not like this community. They're really not impacted by this quote unquote anti-Semitism. They're doing so well.
Yeah, actually, I think that's one of the things that we could, no, I think that's actually really good. And we could talk about it here. We could even talk about in the history of anti-Semitism. The difference between, and look, all forms of hate are equally serious and damaging, that's clearly, but anti-Semitism manifests a little differently sometimes. And that's why understanding Judaism, because it is a form in many respects of punching up. That's a phrase Alan and I use a lot, because they believe the conspiracy theory is Jews are all powerful and controlling. We've been so successful. And really, our role is to control the other marginalized groups. And that's a phrase that is used a lot. So I actually think that is when we talk about the history and the way it's manifesting today, I think that's actually when we should put that in there. And then, just because you're successful, it's the difference is that with other marginalized groups, there's this feeling that they are inferior. With Jews, we're too superior. And so it's a weird thing.
Well, you get both ends of you're a dirty Jew and you don't have this, but also you're controlling the world.
Exactly.
I mean, so
control.
which is it?
The flexibility of anti-Semitism. I think an interesting statistic is to point out there's a very high percentage of Jewish seniors who live in poverty.
Right? Yeah.
And I think if you go to the Metropolitan Council on Poverty, I think one of the things that it's important to explain is one of the reasons why, when they've done polls and they've asked people, how big do you think Israel is a country? They always think it's like the size of Texas. And, George Bush famously said there are driveways in Israel that are longer than in Texas, that are longer from the borders, from the 1967 borders. And I think that because Israel gets so much coverage, because Jews are a minority, and because it's a period of conflict and media focus, we get so much more attention more than I want, that the Jewish community is constantly in the public eye. And I think it's important to say that yet we have to be careful about how we say successful. The Jewish community, the Episcopalian community in the United States is the most wealthiest Christian group, according to the last survey that I said. But nobody talks about the control of the Episcopalians. They talk about, and there's far more of them than us. And the reality is that because our neighbors, because we're so few and we're clustered, there's large parts of Americans who have never met Jews. And I think you guys probably know the information better than this, because I know but that when you meet Jews, your level of anti-Semitism goes down. So you guys probably have all the statistics, Meredith, to do that. So even in a county like Montgomery County, where there's very few areas you would identify as Jewish neighborhoods, certainly not where we come from, Meredith, in New York, where I can tell you there's a Jewish neighborhood.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that we're very integrated into society, Jews also have a history of valuing education in a society that promotes social mobility. So because of that emphasis on education, the Jewish community has been successful, and the Jewish community has also been drawn to politics because of political weakness in other countries and because of our values to serve. They're all good values. And as a result, there's a disproportionate amount of Jews in our population that are in positions of influence, or I hate to use that word, who are positions where they're able to have an impact on society. And people know that. when you look at the council or you look at things, people, oh, there's how many Jews on the council? How much are, and so that clearly has to be stamped out. Jews cannot be, it is not okay to be anti-Semitism, to be anti-Semitic, because Jews have achieved success. Because the dream of the American society is to pull, is that an immigrant generation arrives and their children move up in social mobility. And
I put in,
should not be faulted. If anything, it should be modeled and emulated. It should not be a sign of disrespect. And that's what gets me crazy, because like you said, we're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't. Well, I don't want to be damned for either. And
I put in here, Ron, I wrote that we should note the percentage of Jews in the United States.
1.8.
I think that, and also the percentage in Montgomery County. I think that that's, the numbers. I think it's important just so people understand what we're talking about. Yeah.
And to Ron's point about, though,
I'm sorry, Alec, go ahead.
well, I was just saying, to Ron's point about not every Jewish family in Montgomery County is a millionaire, and I mean, there is a real difference in that it's, I think, pointing out the differences and demonstrating that, like you do a bell curve in any community, you're going to have that as well. But also to Ron's point about, and to the earlier point, I guess, that Jeff made about democracies being able in Maryland and in Montgomery County in particular to I don't want to say take advantage, but to part of the culture is learning and education and promoting that.
Yep.
And as children of immigrants who were told, this is how you get ahead in a free society, or one that encourages upward mobility and open at public education, and really, like, anyone can go to public school and go to get into a college or something. And I'm not talking about Harvard. I mean, like, there are more opportunities in the United States and other places, and the culture is promoting that. And so which is it? But not every family here has a dual income where he makes $1 million and she makes $1 million. And I mean, and we struggle, and I think the community tries to help its own, as well as, I don't want to get into tikkun olam and things of that nature, but there is an aspect of that to this, that one, we are taught to charity begins at home, and stuck it there, and then sort of concentric circles outward. But I like Ron's point about pointing out that we have a very big part of the Jewish community, both at young families and children who are in need of support, and seniors as well. So it's a good comment, so that you don't, oh no, well, in Montgomery County it's really, you're just saying that because you don't like it. Everybody here is fine.
No, I agree. I think Alan.
Let me just interject a couple of things. First, I don't think we need to be defensive about this. I wouldn't go over it, too much, because it doesn't, I don't think it helps to sort of harp on it. I think people understand in a couple of sentences we can deal with it. I wouldn't spend that much time on it. Two things I did want to mention, though. One is that we need to talk about Jews of color. Because in terms of being diverse, we need to let people know that we're not all white and privileged. And second,
Alan, we should use that slide. You and I both have one that has like the images of everybody. You know what I'm talking about? You and I think have the same one.
The demographic report has a quote about what percent of our community is Jews of color. I'll get it for you now.
Yeah, it's between 7 and 15%, depending on who you ask. That's that's what I've seen.
I think
the other thing we need to mention, though, is that, and this is I think the best throwaway line that describes our community. There are Jews who are atheists. And whenever I tell people that, their heads explode, because how can you be Jewish and not believe in Judaism or not believe in God? Well, because Jews are not a religion. Jews are a people, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that in and of itself, I think is just a quick point that brings home all the stuff you've been talking about in terms of diversity and the difference between a religious group and a people. So I think that's a good point. I think we should make as well.
Great. All right, I think we can move on to the next one. Jeff, I saw your hand before. Did you have a question?
No, Alan actually hit the hammer on the head on views of color. I would just say too, I mean, anything that highlights intersectionality could be very powerful here. I think that even enlightened community members probably don't really know what's exactly under the hood on this. I think anything you can highlight for other experience. I know you highlighted the faith spectrum, which I think is very broad and diverse. You highlighted different backgrounds, obviously folks from different heritages, and also folks who actively make the decision to enter the community. Those are all very different worlds. So I just think it's very powerful to highlight. This is the whole point, is that you're all at ground zero for every conversation. That's what we're all
No
here.
pressure.
No pressure, but that's just a fact, and I think that's just important for other cohorts to understand that. So
yeah, no, I appreciate that. I'm glad you were here. Thank you. Okay, so the next section, and again, there's not necessarily an order to this. I think we can fine tune that, but the impacts of extremism in general to other communities. We kind of answered a lot of this and some of the other things. We talked about things like democracy fractures, implications of national security, really specifically like the special envoy. I think two things too, when we ask the question of, what can be done to eliminate some of this, I think that, we have to be realistic. Look, we've all been fighting hate for a really long time. I think this is where we can focus a little bit on some of the suppression and some of the things that potentially can be done that can be counteracted, whether that's legislative solutions, whether it's, funding, from safety and security, whether it's trainings for law enforcement to understand better when an incident happens, how to handle the nature of a bias incident, anti-Semitism, anti-AAPI hate, whatever it is. I think that's some of the things that that's what the thoughts that we were talking about, the impacts of extremism, and that understanding also, and this goes back to some of the history of anti-Semitism, that so much of hate is rooted in anti-Semitism. So a lot of the extremist groups that exist today are based, and their belief system, QAnon, as Alan mentioned earlier, is anti-Semitic. And that means they hate everybody else too, but that is so much of it is rooted in anti-Semitism, which actually could be a good thing that we actually are going first as the cohort to set the stage to explain that. And that's really the roots of a lot of the extremism we see, is coming from, because they believe Jews are controlling all of these other groups, and that we created the LGBTQ community, we created the slave trade. I mean, these conspiracy theories. So that was some of the thinking of why we wanted to talk about impacts of extremism. So that is my spiel, and please, everybody else, add however you want.
I mean, that's a great intersectional point, Meredith. I think, you hit it right on the head. And if you talk about it that way in an inclusive manner, I think it'll bring people closer into what we're talking about and give them a little bit of skin in the game. So I would definitely make that an important aspect of what you're talking about.
Can you see me, by the way, on the screen?
We can see you. Yeah.
You see it just fine.
Okay, so I just want to say, so here's a couple quick statistics. 2% of the members of our community were raised in a Russian-speaking household. 4%, and I'm sorry, here's a good about Greater Washington. 7% of our Jewish community throughout the region identifies as LGBTQ. 7% of our Jewish community identify as a person of color or having Hispanic or Latino origin. 1% of the Jews in this community are Holocaust survivors.
Ron, can you email me all that so I can make sure I include it in here? I made a note.
It's a very interesting, Russian, Israeli, diverse, LGBT, Jews of color. I mean, it's just,
Okay, anything else on this one? I mean, I think we got a bunch of it. Okay, so I'm going to move on because I think the next three are kind of really good. So education in K through 12, college campus, workplace, community in general, and specifically, so really what can the county be doing to increase awareness, understanding about the crimes and incidents, educational institutions, workplace, nonprofits. I think this is really where we can be talking about some of the things, honestly, from an organizational perspective, what we are doing and recommendations that we have that we think that the county should be doing, like trainings for all of county employees,
Right.
for example. So I'm just gonna, throw that out there first. So please chime in.
Well, again, I think that's an area where we can look to the White House plan because they
Yeah,
have
you know
all
what?
these
I'm gonna put that. Do you want me to put
recommendations.
that under here, Alan?
Yeah, I think that's a good
Okay.
place for it. I know that
Perfect.
I'm forgetting her name, but one of the colleagues at the council read the plan, and it was her assessment that the council was already doing many, if not all, of the things that the White House plan is calling for, which is a great way of acknowledging that to the council. And then we talk about the whole of society approach and how the council and how the county, as you said, the trainings, but also can have influence on other sectors within the county by showing an example and calling on workplaces and schools and all of these other places to take the kinds of steps that the county has, I think would be a very powerful message.
Well, there's a lot in that pillar 3, reversing the normalization of anti-Semitism. A lot of that you can almost pull like almost directly, but I mean, it depends. A lot of these things that they recommend that happen on the federal level can also happen on the state and local level. I mean, there could be Jewish Heritage Month should be celebrated, money should be allocated like it is to other groups for that. And I can give you 10 other things, then we can probably pull it right out of the report.
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in there.
The question is, which ones do we want to recommend as priorities?
I mean, a couple of the things. So some of it is very specific to the federal government. So like the different agencies, for example, have to do different trainings. I think we can extrapolate that. And I think this is recommendations I know we've been pulling out, and I believe Alan AJC has been looking at this too in recommendations, and actually I'm meeting with Denver soon to talk about some of this, I think.
Good.
Is specifically on how to bring this to a local, state and local level. And so for this, I think that's the recommendation, like when I said county employees, thinking of all the different agencies, and bringing in organizations who are experts in this to train them in it. That is something that the county government, and that could come from the county executive and the county council, can make a recommendation or even pass something that says, employees must go through these types of trainings related to hate and bias, and then specifically bringing in different groups who have expertise in the different types of hate to come in and do trainings. And it could be during Jewish American Heritage Month or AAPI Month or Black History Month, as a time to do it. But I think that needs to be a strong recommendation, in my opinion. As a chair, I'm going to say that.
Meredith, how does that align with the current DEI requirements within state and local agencies? I don't know exactly how it works. I just know that one of the things we've been working on is trying to ensure that anti-Semitism is included in the portfolio.
It's not in most, Alan.
Right.
It's not in most. It's not. Yeah. Anti-Semitism is not most. Same thing in the private workforce, which So I think I think that's what you just said is the key.
Yeah, I think that's what we're talking about here, is making sure that that whatever's being taught in these settings is inclusive not only of anti-Semitism, but particularly in our view, anti-Semitism, but that people, like you said, of marginalized communities, everyone counts, and everyone gets to, people need to understand what's going on in each of these communities and not just focus it on one or two.
I think that, like, for example, the stuff that's going on at Whitman tomorrow, and that Meredith and
I'll see you tomorrow morning.
You won't see my colleagues, obviously, but I'll be dropping by part of the day. Are doing where we're going to train 700 people who are part of the Walt Whitman cluster in that. I think that It is not the responsibility of the Jewish community to stamp out anti-Semitism. It is the responsibility of anti-Semites to not being anti-Semitic. And I'll never forget that at the Pittsburgh gathering on, and you know what I'm going to refer to because I said this together, the best speech was given by Muriel Bowser, who said, "We failed you this weekend," meaning that she was saying the non-Jewish community failed to protect the Jewish community. And I think the non-Jewish community has to take ownership of anti-Semitism in its ranks, and that it must be non-Jews who have to lead the fight, because most Jews are not anti-Semitic. And I know it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but the reality is that I don't hate Jews, and therefore you don't have to work with me on anti-Semitism, but it has to be a strategy in everything. And so, you know, in as much as we promote the positivism, I'm wondering if there's a role for an anti-hate month or an anti-bias month, or a place where we would focus. In other words, if we're going to institutionalize that employers in Montgomery County, like list them, employers who do anti-bias training should be publicly commended. It should be just for Jews, against Jews, Latinos, LGBTQ, everybody. It should be a month. It should be a month a year, or whatever it is. So we make it into an effort where there's money thrown behind it, where every organization is behind it, where companies, chambers, business, unions, government. It's a month at Montgomery County where we focus on stamping out. And it has to be ritualized, institutionalized, and systematic. Because if it's not, it's baloney. It just goes away. And so and again, I'm not, you know, I'm not doing the diversity training. Members of my colleagues, I know you do it. Members of my staff have done it. They've done it at places like the Wildlife Foundation. They've done it for the Department of Education on the federal level. We've done it in nonprofits. And Meredith is right. They don't talk about Jews because they think we're white, and because we're white, therefore we don't have to worry about us. So I think that the only way we're going to the only way we're going to make a huge societal dent among our 1.01 million people in Montgomery County is if we make it a strategic goal of the county to stamp out bias in all its forms. And there's got to be agreed upon community strategy, and it's got to be over and over and over again, to the point where people are like, yeah, in our county, like for the next 50 years, I know it sounds crazy, we're sitting here, because I won't be alive in 50 years, but maybe I'll be 104, I don't know, but anyway, but the bottom line is that I know it sounds crazy, but we're dealing with a disease that's viral and systematic. And if we don't make it an effort where all of society's influencers, Jewish and non,
Yeah, so no, I mean, point very, very valid. And I think that was, look, those of us who have been talking about this, that's part of, I think, the whole point of creating the task force, and why it's a time period that we're working on this, and it's not an ongoing task force. Like the State Hate Crimes Commission is a little bit different because it's addressing things, but I think I think that is a point that we do need to make, and we need to be very clear about that when we're asking, and I wrote to the next one, the role of public officials and other community leaders. It needs to not just be the community that is facing it, speaking out. It needs to be allies. This is about being an upstander, not a bystander. And unfortunately, when things like MCPS originally did, I'm using this as an example, the anti-racist audit, you know, everything related to the Jewish community was honestly left out. And not just the Jewish community, it was focused on some really narrow aspects of racism. Not bad, but they're, unfortunately, in hindsight, they left things out. I think we need to be very realistic about that and saying we're playing a little bit of catch up now. And we want to make sure, because as anti-Semitism, because we are the Jewish cohort talking about this, has risen, there has been a lack of understanding. And now we're going in, like with Whitman tomorrow, and doing training in pre-service day. I was at Consortia today for some things. Like, that's the kind of stuff that it needs, but it needs to not just be one-offs. It needs to be consistently. So new employees come into the county. That's a recommendation the task force could make. Every new employee has to go through some sort of a training, just like you have to go through training to understand what your password is for your computer. this should be I mean, but it's seriously, like, this should be this should be a consistent part of it. And I think that's a strong recommendation that could come out of the task force. Alec, I'm going to write that down while you talk.
I was just going to echo that sentiment that I'm not sure. I don't want to use the phrase beat someone over the head, but I think it has to be integrated into this. Like I have an annual security thing for work. I've taken the class every year. I have to, sometimes it's twice a year, oh, here, don't leave your computer open at Starbucks. And, I have to take a DEI course. I mean, these are things that even though I've been at this job for 13 years, I still have to take it just because I have to pass it. So I think the
sexual harassment training.
Right, sexual
Yeah.
harassment training every year.
Yes, exactly. Harassment training. So I totally agree with what you and Ron have said, that this has to be a regular and sustained effort. It may not have to be ratcheted up to 10, but certainly new employees, certainly in schools and programs, certainly as a regular stated day or an event or whatever that is recognized as such in that matter. Because as the week and a half thinking about this, Colin, what we were going to say, and how I don't have an answer. Yeah. If we had an answer, we wouldn't be having this discussion right now at all. Sure. Right. And we're not the only ones here in Montgomery County having this conversation, of course. So to Ron's earlier point, we ain't solving racism or anti-Semitism today. But how can we the short answer is raising awareness. How can we do that systemically and formally through processes?
Yeah, and look, we wouldn't ask the Black community to solve racism on its own, and you can't ask the Jewish community to solve anti-Semitism on its own. It's got to come from our allies. It's got to come from our friends, and that's where public officials come in, and that's where the rest of the council and not just the Jewish members have to take a stand on this and stand up. But I like Ron's idea of the month of anti-hate. And I like this idea of making sure that there is this anti-bias, anti-hate training that includes anti-Semitism in particular for us, but it is intersectional. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's a very good thing.
You'll know that we've achieved things when when I feel best, when I don't have to, when I call the police after an incident, or, usually, either Meredith gets to them or then I get to them, or we both, whatever. But one of the things that I'm proud about in Montgomery County is that when I call, whether it was Chief Manger or Chief Jones, was that when an incident happened, they would already say, oh, we've already increased patrols. Like it's already done. Like we already told the squad and they're out there. I got to be honest. I went ahead and in DC, I told them, and sometimes in Virginia, I have to remind. And that's, from years ago. There's been a lot of progress in the last few years. We're at the point, but it's not my responsibility to change the mind of 300 million non-Jews and the 300 million people in the United States not to be anti-Semitic. It's the responsibility of those 300 million people not to hate me and my family or anybody on this call who happens to be Jewish. It's just, and I think that we have to pass the baton and say, guys, this is as much. I don't want to be hated because I'm the one who gets hurt, but on the other hand, it's your responsibility to stop being so dumb and so hateful. And it's everyone's responsibility as a society to eradicate this. And I know it sounds, it's my responsibility as a member of American society not to be anti-Asian American. It's my responsibility not to be anti-LGBTQ, anti-Latino. That's my responsibility. That's my responsibility, is not to hate others. My heart has to be where I'm not, but if I am, it's my responsibility. It's not the responsibility of the people who are the object of my insane infatuation and hatred to be there, because they're the victim.
Yeah.
So it's like blaming the victim of a crime for something.
So I want to be conscious of time, and we're at the 8 o'clock hour. I think we have a good layout here. I'm going to run through real quick what we talked about, and then I will start creating just some slides with some of the information. I will reach out for a couple of you to send me some of the information to create the slide deck. And then we're presenting next Tuesday. So
Glad to help in any way, Meredith. I got,
Yeah,
we got
what
a
else?
lot of stuff. We can make it happen.
Say that again?
Just glad to help in any way. If you want to, run stuff, or, we can always just check in with one another because we've got all this information and
Oh,
slides.
yeah.
We can pull it all
Oh.
together.
Yeah, I'm gonna need
Now, I was
some of the
saying,
things from you.
I'm sorry, I already sent you the 3 demographic points that you wanted.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I wanna, some of it is gonna be visual aids, and I'll obviously, I mean, I have a lot of the information based on everybody's feedback, and then what I will probably do is there are different parts I'm gonna assign, in other words, so I'm gonna call on you, like a teacher moment, when we're presenting and stuff, and just say, could you, take 30 seconds and just explain, a little bit more about this, just so it's not just me, because this really is a collaborative effort. So, and I may move this around a little bit just as I see the flow, as I'm just creating the master slides, which will be generic. It's not going to have, it's going to say Jewish cohort. It's not going to have ADL on it, AJC on it, JCRZ, Alex Stone. It will just be, I mean, Alec, unless you'd like to create a logo for yourself.
You think we would miss if there was another Jewish organization? I mean, we create
Washington Hebrew, but Rabbi Shank was not here, so I'll speak for her.
Alex Stone Associates. I like that. Sounds good.
So we'll start up with just the overview of the history of anti-Semitism. And then I actually think we may do understanding Judaism and Jewish community actually after that, and then go into how it's manifesting today, because those kind of, I think, but I want to just see how it flows. We'll talk about the correlation of anti-Semitism to other forms of hate, which really does talk about then the impacts of extremism in general in the communities, what we can be doing to solve some of that, or at least suppress some of it, as we were saying, or not, have it not mainstream. Really talking about the different educational aspects, the White House National Strategy, recommendations, and what I'll do, I'll also put a couple of bullet points of recommendations we talked about within that, the trainings, and then specifically what we think the role of public officials and other community leaders to be. And we will, throughout this also, there will be aspects, it's focus on anti-Semitism, the Jewish cohort. We're supposed to present how this is impacting our community. But as we talked about, we're presenting first, and I do think we can set a framework, which we talked about it, that the intersectionality and how a lot of the extremism hate we see is rooted in anti-Semitism, and throughout history we have seen this lead to other forms of hate, which is why it is so concerning to all of us. And so that, I think, gives us a good framework for everything, and I think we can get it done in 30 minutes.
I think so too, and then we'll take questions.
Yeah. Right. Is that right, Bertha? Is that just, okay, so now that we have this, What else do we need to know?
I think you pretty much nailed it. There will be a Q&A after your presentation. So, it's open to the rest of the cohorts to ask questions, and any members of the public that join. Selena and I will be sending a reminder for next week's meeting along with the Zoom. So you should be getting that tomorrow or the day after.
Okay, great. And then I assume I'll have ability to share screen so that I can share any slides or anything like that. Perfect. Great. Look at that, guys. A little over an hour and we are done. See, I knew we could do this.
Well done, Meredith. Well done.
Well done, Meredith.
Hey, thank you. Thank you. Kidding. No, this is everybody. So thank you all. Then I think we're good. Everybody have a good evening. And then I will send around any other questions that I have, and I'll touch base with anything info that I need from each of you.
Sounds good.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Take care.